How many of us love a story that ends with a cliffhanger? Anybody? How many of us really don't like those at all? A cliffhanger is just a technique, right? A storytelling technique that leaves something unresolved at the end of the story, something that we want to keep chewing on, and maybe it keeps us reading a little more, or we're waiting for the next book to come out, or we're binge watching the next TV shows until we can get the answers to all of our questions. But if the cliffhanger is too abrupt, it does nothing but make us frustrated, right? Now, those endings were not always called cliffhangers. That term came about after 1873 when an author named Thomas Hardy wrote a short story for a magazine. The story was called A Pair of Blue Eyes, and at the end of the story, one of the characters is literally hanging from the edge of a cliff. The end. What happened to the guy? I assume it was a male. I don't know. Did he fall? Did somebody rescue him? Did he figure out a way to get up the cliff? Or did he fall and survive? No one knows. But that word cliffhanger stuck. And so now every time we have an ending where there's just no resolution, we call it a cliffhanger. Now our reading today is a real cliffhanger. Now we're in Mark's Gospel, and Linda read for us the original ending of Mark's Gospel, where 3 women go to the tomb. They want to anoint the body of Jesus, show their respects to their teacher. But when they get there, Jesus is gone. There's another person in the tomb who talks to them and says, Jesus is going to Galilee. You can go there. Tell the disciples to go to Galilee and meet up with Jesus there. And the women are terrified and amazed, and they tell nobody. Do the disciples ever find out? Does anybody go to Galilee to look for Jesus? Do the women ever tell? The story says they tell no one. And who is this guy sitting in the tomb? And where is Jesus? Jesus rose from the dead, but he doesn't even make an appearance in Mark's Gospel at the end. It is a cliffhanger. Now, this particular ending of Mark bothered the church fathers so badly that they had to write 2 new endings to the Gospel of Mark. And if you have a study Bible, if you look at the end of Mark chapter 16, at the end of our reading today, you'll see a heading that says, a shorter ending of Mark. And then there's a few lines. And then there's another heading that says, a longer ending of Mark. And there's more. And if you read the footnotes will say, these endings come from the 4th century and the 2nd century. We know that the author of Mark did not write them. They used different words, different sentence structure. It doesn't sound like Mark at all. It sounds like, sort of like a priest wrote those endings. Check it out for yourself. What we do when we get to a story like this one, and there's too many holes, particularly among the gospel stories, we'll go to a different story and we'll find the answers. We'll go look and see what Matthew says about the empty tomb. And then we'll look at Mark, and then we'll look at Luke, and then we'll look at John, and we'll smash them all together until we feel like we've got the complete story. Now, scholar James Tabor says that's a mistake. We should not be mushing them all together, because when we do that, we're actually writing our own gospel. It's the gospel according to Judy, or the gospel according to Bill, which I'm sure would be very entertaining, but it's not the one in our Bible. What happens when we smash them all together is we lose the message that each gospel writer wants us to learn. So Mark has a reason for ending his gospel with 3 women that run away afraid and tell nobody. He wants us to discover something. And when we try to answer what might have happened and make something up in our heads, we are missing the point that he wants us to discover. So let's go into that gospel reading and let's figure out what maybe Mark wants us to do. Now let's go back, actually, chapter 15, just to kind of give us some context before we get into our reading today. Jesus was crucified. All the disciples left him. And as he's hanging on the cross, the women are watching from a distance. Women were largely invisible, so their lives weren't on the line for being present, but they were not right at the foot of the cross, according to Mark's gospel. They were a ways away, and they're watching. At noon, as Jesus is on the cross, the sun stops shining, and it gets dark. And it's dark until 3 o'clock. Jesus dies. Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate and asks for the body of Jesus. Pilate agrees. Joseph buys a linen cloth, wraps it around the body of Jesus, lays him in a tomb, rolls the stone in front of the entrance to the tomb, which of course keeps the animals out and keeps the smell in. The women, 2 of the Marys, are watching from a distance. They want to know where the tomb is because they've got a plan. They're going to go as soon as they can. They're going to anoint the body of their beloved teacher. They are going to show their respect for him. They're going to care for his body. But they can't do it right away because it's Sabbath. They have to go home from Friday at sundown until Saturday at sundown. So the soonest they can return is Sunday morning, the first morning of the week. That's when our reading starts. The women are walking to the tomb, and the sun is rising. And we have this contrast in Mark's gospel with the darkness that happened when Jesus was on the cross, and now we have this light showing us that something has changed. There's been some kind of transformation. Now, the women do not have a great plan because they have no idea how they're going to move that stone. They have their spices, they have their oils, they're ready to go. They don't know how they're going to get that stone moved away from the entrance, but when they get there, it's already moved. So they walk into the tomb expecting to see a dead body. And instead, they see a young man, a live person, sitting in the tomb. Who is this guy? How many of you were raised or thought that it was an angel? Even the footnotes in my study Bible say, even though the Greek text doesn't say this, we should think of this as an angel. I find that interesting. Now, you do see that in the Bible in a couple places, notably back in Daniel in the Old Testament. But in this section, I feel like Mark would have said angel if Mark meant angel. But he didn't. The Greek here says young man or youth. It doesn't say angel. So we don't know for sure. But there's this person sitting in the tomb. Now, this week I listened to a podcast called Pulpit Fiction, where Pastor Rob McCoy talks about this young man and suggests that it's a real person and that it might be a young man that we read about in Mark's gospel back in chapter 14 when Jesus is being arrested. The soldiers have Jesus. All the disciples have fled again, trying to save their lives. But there is a young man following Jesus, and he's wearing nothing but a linen robe. And the soldiers try to seize him, and he gets out of that robe, and he runs away naked into the darkness. 2 of the weirdest sentences in the entire Gospel of Mark. Why is this guy in there? Why is it notable that he runs away naked and afraid in the darkness? Well, McCoy suggests that this is that young man again. Now he's clothed in white, he's sitting in the tomb, and he's telling the women about Jesus. He's showing us the transformation that can happen when we are followers of Jesus. That we start out naked and afraid in the darkness, running for our lives, and we end up sitting in the place of resurrection, wearing white, and telling everyone about Jesus. That is an attractive thought to me. And I hope that that is what Mark meant, because this man might show us this is what it's going to look like for you if you follow Jesus. Now, what does he tell those women? He says, don't be alarmed. Do not be afraid. If you walked into a tomb, number 1, you're probably already afraid. Number 2, if there's somebody in there who's talking to you, you're going to be more than a little afraid. Didn't work, but he tried. He said, don't be afraid. You're looking for Jesus. He's not here. He rose from the dead, and he's gone to Galilee. So tell the disciples, tell Peter to go to Galilee, and you can meet up with him there. Now, what is it about Galilee? Because let's understand, Galilee is a region. This young man is not saying, Jesus went to the corner of Mechanic and Biddle, and you can find him there. This young man is saying, Jesus went to Jackson, Michigan. We don't know exactly where he is. My Jesus would be at the Dirty Bird eating the sweet potato fries. But maybe your Jesus would be somewhere else. Where would we find Jesus? Jackson's a big place. Galilee's a big place. So what is it about Galilee? Now, if we went all the way back to Mark chapter 1, we would realize that Mark begins Jesus' ministry in Galilee. There's no birth story in Mark. There's no trip to Bethlehem. There's no census. There's no manger. There's no nativity. There's no shepherds. There are no angels. There's just Jesus going to the Jordan to be baptized, going to the wilderness for a 40-day fast, and then he begins his ministry in Galilee, walking from place to place. Mark is taking us all the way back to the beginning. Go back to Galilee. Go back to the beginning of the gospel. Go back to the first chapter. If you've gotten to the empty tomb and you don't know what to do with this ending, you go back to Galilee. You go back to the beginning and you read again. You listen again to the story of Jesus. You remember the words that he taught, and you understand what it costs to be a disciple by the time you get to the end. And if you get to the end and you still don't know what to do with the ending, you go back again to Galilee and you remember the story of Jesus. Now, it's interesting that the Greek word for tomb, the root of that word, is the same as the root for memory. McCoy suggests that instead of saying, who's going to roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb, we could translate that line just as easily to say, who will open the door of memory? Now, I know some of you can't remember what you had for lunch yesterday. I get that. I don't remember either. If we can't remember, it's not quite the same as forgetting. Remember is not the opposite of forget. Remember is the opposite of dismember. When you are dismembered, you are cut off from something. You are separated, in this case, from the story of Jesus. If you are remembered, you are reconnected with the story of Jesus, with the story of hope and renewal. And so this story is inviting us not just to remember the facts and the details, but to be remembered with the story, with the teaching of Jesus, with everything that Jesus came to do. So what do we do with all of that? We get to the end of Mark's gospel, and we have to go back to Galilee. We go back to the beginning, and we read it all again. The very first line of Mark's gospel says, this is the beginning of the good news of Jesus. And I don't think that Mark is talking about just chapter 1. This is the beginning of the good news of Jesus. I think Mark is talking about chapter 1 to chapter 16. The whole gospel is the beginning of the good news of Jesus, and the end is right here in front of me. The end is all of you. You are the end of the story. Mark is inviting you to read the story, to hear the story, to experience, to remember. And then at the end, you are with those women. You are walking into the empty tomb. You hear the words of the young man, and you are afraid. What do? Do you go home and not tell anybody ever? Or do you tell people what you know to be true about Jesus? Do you share the hope that we have? Do you share the story of Jesus with others? Or do you say nothing to anybody? You see, you are the cliffhanger. You are the ones to resolve the end of this gospel, and only you can do it. Those church fathers, they almost had it right, I think. They wrote endings that they thought would be good for everybody, but this gospel is not trying to get to an end that's good for everybody. It wants an ending that's good for you, an ending that you can live, an ending that makes you an Easter person every single morning. So I want to invite you to do something. I want you to listen to a sentence and finish it for yourself. And the sentence goes like this: now that I have heard the story of Jesus, now that I have remembered what Jesus came to teach us, now that I understand what it means to follow Jesus, I will... It's a cliffhanger. What will you do?